The broom was made of birch twigs bound with rusted baling wire, its handle worn so smooth by Mateo's calloused palms that it would felt like polished bone. Every stroke against the steel rail produced a dry, rasping sound. Hiss-scrape, hiss-scrape, that was instantly swallowed by the endless, deadening quiet of the valley. Above the station, the sky was not black, nor was it white. It was the color of a wet slate slab, featureless and heavy, pressing down on the snow-covered pine canopy until branches groaned under the weight. And from that sky fell the snow. It was never white. It fell in soft, oily, gray flakes that smelled faintly of cold cinder and scorched wool. It did not melt when it touched Mateo's wool coat. It clung to the fabric, accumulating in the folds of his sleeves like volcanic ash. If allowed to sit on the iron rails for more than an hour, it would harden into a greasy, cement-like crust that locked the switches and buried the ties. Mateo pulled his silver pocket watch from his vest. The crystal glass was scratched, lined with a spiderweb crack across the face. The hands rested at 23:54. They had rested at 23:54 for as long as his knees had ached, which was a time far longer than his memory cared to measure. He lowered the watch, tucked it back beneath his heavy oilskin vest, and bent his back once more to the broom. Hiss-scrape, hiss-scrape. You're working the south switch early tonight, Mateo. A voice called out from the darkness of the platform. The voice was thin, dry, and papery, like dead birch leaves rustling across ice. Mateo didn't stop sweeping. He pushed a heap of gray ash snow off the iron flange, watching it roll into the dark ballast stones below. The wind is coming out of the notch, Clara, Mateo replied without looking up. His breath formed no plume in the freezing air. If I don't clear the frog before the midnight pass, the ice will pack the points. Clara stepped out from beneath the overhanging eaves of the wooden station building. She wore a thick gray shawl wrapped 3 times around her narrow shoulders, her hands tucked deep into a fur muff that had long since lost its hair. Her face was pale, not the flush-cheeked pale of a woman standing in a snowstorm, but a translucent, waxy gray that seemed to absorb the dim amber light of the station's kerosene wall lanterns. She walked toward the edge of the platform, but her boots made no crunching sound in the snow. They glided over the drifts, leaving faint, shallow impressions that filled with gray flakes the moment she passed. "There's no frost on the glass tonight," Clara murmured, her eyes fixed on the empty iron rails stretching south into the gloom. "The valley is too heavy for frost." "It's cold enough," Mateo said, straightening his back. He leaned on the birch handle, wiping a gloved hand across his forehead. His skin felt numb, tough as boiled leather. "Did you check the waiting room stove?" "I put 3 logs of birch on the grate," she said. "Did they catch?" Clara hesitated. She looked down at her hands and sighed the frayed muff. "Though it doesn't burn like it used to, Mateo. It glows red at the heart, but it gives off no ash. It gives off no heat, either. It just sits there." Mateo didn't answer. He turned his eyes down the line, staring into the impenetrable wall of gray snow that choked the valley floor. The station, the midnight terminal, as the old timber sign above the ticket window proclaimed in faded gold lettering, was built entirely of heavy pine logs and iron bolts. It sat in a narrow gorge wedged between 2 sheer granite cliffs that rose hundreds of feet into the gray sky. There were no roads leading out of the valley. There were no footpaths through the high passes. There was only the single iron track, cutting through the snow from the dark tunnel in the north to the narrow canyon bridge in the south. Every house in the small settlement tucked against the cliff wall was made of the same dark timber. Every chimney gave off a thin, straight thread of pale smoke that rose 20 feet before dissolving into the falling ash. And every soul who lived in those timber cabins spent their days with a birch broom or an iron shovel, clearing the gray flakes from their doorways, from their roofs, and above all, from the iron rails. It was the first rule of the valley, the only rule that mattered. Keep the iron clear. Never let the tracks go gray. "Old Thomas stopped sweeping his porch today," Clara said softly, her voice carrying a faint hollow whistle, like wind blowing through an empty bottle. Mateo turned his head sharply. "Thomas? His roof will cave if the weight builds." "He didn't care," Clara murmured. "He sat in his rocking chair by the cold hearth. When I called him through the glass, he didn't turn around. His voice, Mateo, when he answered me, it didn't sound like words anymore. It sounded like the wind scraping against the eaves. A cold, familiar tightness gripped Mateo's chest, a dull, heavy ache that sat right beneath his sternum. He knew what that meant. He had seen it happen to Miller 2 months ago, and to the widow Vance before that. First, they stopped shoveling. Then, they stopped speaking in names and dates. Their faces lost their sharp edges, smoothing out into gray, featureless ovals, until one evening they simply walked down to the platform, waited for the midnight pass, and vanished. "He's getting light," Mateo muttered, turning back to the rail. "He's letting the snow get inside him." "We're all getting light, Mateo," Clara said. She reached out a hand from her shawl, holding her fingers up between Mateo's eyes and the amber lantern on the wall. The warm yellow light shone straight through her palm. The bones of her fingers were visible as faint, cloudy shadows, but the flesh was as clear as glass left in a mountain stream. Mateo looked away instantly, his jaw tightening until his teeth clicked. "I have work to do," he snapped, swinging his broom with sudden violent force, spraying gray flakes across the platform edge. "The 2359 will be at the signal post in 5 minutes. "She isn't on it, Mateo," Clara whispered, her voice trailing off into a soft, wheezing sigh that sounded alarmingly like the drift of snow against the pine boards. "She's never on it." "She will be," Mateo growled through gritted teeth. "Annalise promised. She took the early morning coach to the city for her dress pattern. She said she'd be back on the night return. The train always comes back." Clara looked at him with eyes that held no anger, no pity, no emotion at all, only an endless, icy stillness. "The city was 40 years ago, Mateo," she whispered. "Shut your mouth." Mateo barked, slamming the birch broom against the iron rail, with a dull thud that produced no echo. "Clear the line. Help me clear the line, or go back inside." Clara didn't flinch. She simply turned, her gray shawl fluttering like a dying moth's wing, and glided back toward the dark doorway of the waiting room. Mateo stood alone on the snow-choked tracks, his chest heaving, his hands shaking around the polished wood of his broom. He looked down the long, straight line of iron rails stretching into the gray wall of falling ash. He pulled his watch out once more. 23:58. And then, from deep within the narrow granite canyon to the north, came the sound. It was not a whistle. It made no steam hiss, no clanking of iron rods, no rumble of heavy steel wheels against steel rails. It was a silence so absolute, so heavy, that it pushed the air right out of Mateo's lungs. The falling gray flakes seemed to freeze in midair. The wind dying in the pine canopy went dead. Down the line, emerging from the pitch-black mouth of the mountain tunnel, came the engine. It was vast, towering, and painted an unholy, light-absorbing black, a black so deep that it looked like a hole cut out of the gray world. It had no headlamp. It threw no cinders from its tall stack. It glided over the cleared iron rails without making a single sound, pulling a long, endless line of dark passenger coaches whose windows were completely frosted over with thick, black ice. The midnight train had arrived. The black engine drifted past the wooden platform like a shadow sliding over oil. Despite its towering size, its heavy iron drive wheels standing higher than Mateo's shoulders, its displacement left no breeze. The air around the engine was dead, cold, and heavy, smelling faintly of old river mud and dry, crushed leaves. Mateo stood on the edge of the timber platform, his hand gripped tight around the birch broom. He didn't step back. He had stood in this exact spot every single night, watching the long line of dark coaches roll to a smooth, soundless stop. Clack! With a single, muted impact of iron couplings, the train halted. The heavy passenger cars sat along the platform, their black ice windows reflecting nothing. Not the amber glow of the station's kerosene lanterns, nor the pale gray sky above. There were no faces visible behind the glass, no silhouettes moving in the aisles. Just absolute, impenetrable dark. The heavy oak door of the third coach swung inward with a slow, silent glide. From the dark vestibule, no conductor stepped down. No iron step stool was placed upon the wooden planks. There was only an open threshold, revealing a long, narrow aisle lined with high-backed velvet seats that looked dark blue or black under the faint light of the valley. Mateo took a slow step forward, his boots making no sound against the timber floorboards. "Annalise," he called out. His voice was raw, raspy from years of swallowing the gray ash snow. "Annalise, are you in there?" He leaned toward the open door, peering into the dim aisle of the car. The air drifting out of the coach was completely different from the cold ash of the valley. It smelled of warm wool, dry cedar chest drawers, and the faint, sweet scent of dried lavender, the exact scent his daughter had kept in her linen drawers before she left for the city. Inside the coach, sitting near the middle row, was a shape. It sat perfectly upright, wrapped in a thick, dark coat. Its face was turned toward the frosted window, looking out into the featureless gray of the valley. Mateo's heart took a violent, hammering leap in his chest. His fingers tightened around the broom handle until the wood creaked. "Annalise," he whispered, stepping closer to the open threshold. "Is that you, girl? Step down. I've kept the line clear. The platform is swept." The shape in the seat did not turn its head, but slowly, so slowly that it felt like watching the shadow of a tree move across snow. It raised a thin, translucent hand and pressed its palm against the black ice of the window pane. Where its fingers touched the glass, the dark frost did not melt. Instead, it formed a faint, pale outline of a hand. Mateo raised his foot, bringing his boot right to the edge of the open coach door. Rule 2. A cold voice echoed in the back of his mind. A memory of a rule written on no paper, spoken by no judge, but known to every soul in the valley. Never cross the threshold. Never step onto the black iron floorboards. "Father." The voice did not come from a passenger in the seat. It didn't come from inside the train at all. It was a faint, sweeping whisper that rose from the snow-covered tracks beneath the coach wheels, a sound like dry leaves being dragged through the ballast stones. Mateo froze, his boot hovering an inch above the train's iron step. "Annalise," he gasped, looking down into the dark gap between the platform and the train car. "She's already inside, Mateo." Clara's thin, papery voice called out from behind him. She was standing near the ticket window, her gray shawl wrapped tight around her head. She pointed a translucent finger toward the open door of the third coach. "She's been inside for a long time," Clara whispered. "She's waiting for you to stop sweeping. She's waiting for you to set the broom down and sit beside her." "No!" Mateo shouted, pulling his foot back onto the timber platform, as if the train step were red-hot iron. "No. She told me she was coming back on the return. She's coming off the train." "The train doesn't bring anyone back, Mateo," Clara said quietly. Her voice was losing its sharp edges, softening into the steady, monotonous rustle of the falling ash snow. "It only gathers what is ready to leave." "I am not ready." Mateo roared, swinging his broom around to point the birch twigs at the open coach door. "The line isn't clear. The south switch is still heavy with ice. If I get on, who clears the rails? Who keeps the tracks from going gray?" Clara didn't answer. She simply looked at him with her pale, empty gray eyes, then turned her gaze toward the high, jagged cliffs to the west. Rumble. It was not the train. The sound came from far above the valley floor, a heavy, muffled crunching sound, deep within the pine forest that clung to the sheer granite slopes of the western notch. Mateo swung around, his eyes wide. In 30 years, or 50, or 100, he had never heard a sound from the western mountain trail. The trail was dead. It was choked with 10-foot drifts of gray ash snow, blocked by fallen timber and ancient boulders that no man could move. Nothing came down from the mountain notch. Nothing lived up there. Yet, high up on the zigzag path that cut through the dark pines, a yellow light was flickering. It wasn't the soft, amber glow of a kerosene lantern, nor the deep red of a train signal. It was a harsh, brilliant, blinding yellow beam, a light so sharp and bright that it cut through the falling gray flakes like a knife through canvas. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound of heavy, rubber-soled boots breaking through the frozen crust of snow echoed down the granite walls of the gorge. Mateo stepped back from the train, shielding his eyes from the unholy glare spilling down the slope. On the platform, Clara shrank away, pulling her shawl over her face as if the yellow light were burning her paper-thin skin. Down from the mountain trail, stumbling through the deep gray drifts, came a figure. It wore a bulky, neon-orange winter jacket with reflective silver stripes across the chest. On its head was a hard-shell helmet, and strapped to its back was a heavy black nylon pack with glowing digital displays. In its gloved hand, it held a long metallic cylinder that cast a blinding yellow beam across the timber platform. The figure reached the bottom of the trail, staggered onto the cleared iron rails, and fell to its knees, gasping for air. "Help!" A voice rasped from beneath a thick wool face mask. The voice was heavy, wet, and filled with a frantic, desperate life that shattered the quiet of the valley like breaking glass. Is this the highway maintenance station?" Mateo stood frozen, the birch broom slipping an inch in his calloused hands. The silent black train sat behind him on the track, its open door waiting, its frozen windows unblinking in the sudden, blinding yellow light of the living world. The man on the tracks gasped, his shoulders heaving beneath the neon-orange jacket. Thick clouds of white condensation billowed from his mouth with every breath. Real, hot steam that rose into the freezing air and dissipated slowly. Mateo stared at those clouds of breath. He hadn't seen steam leave a man's lips in so many years. He had forgotten what warmth looked like in the air. The intruder pushed himself up onto his boots, trembling violently. He pulled off his fog safety goggles, revealing wide, bloodshot eyes that darted frantically from the heavy wooden timbers of the terminal to the towering black train sitting silently on the rails. Jesus Christ. The man wheezed, his voice hoarse. He unzipped his face mask, letting it hang around his neck. He looked to be in his late 30s, his stubbled face flushed red from the biting cold. I thought I was going to freeze out there on the pass. My snowplow, the hydraulic line snapped 3 miles back. I walked down the service cut. He stopped, his eyes locking onto Mateo. "Who are you?" the worker asked, his flashlight beam trembling as it swept over Mateo's oilskin vest, his heavy wool trousers, and the birch broom in his hands. Are you the rail keeper? Is this an old heritage line?" Mateo didn't move. He kept his grip firm on the broom handle, stepping sideways to keep himself between the stranger and the open door of the third passenger coach. "You're standing on the frog," Mateo said, his voice flat and hard. "Move off the iron. The 2359 is on the line." The worker blinked, looking down at his feet, then back up at the massive black locomotive resting beside him. He reached out a gloved hand to touch the side of the engine. "What is this?" the worker whispered, his hand hovering inches from the iron hull. "There's no engine scheduled on this branch. The high-notch line was decommissioned 40 years ago." He didn't finish the sentence. He pressed his gloved palm against the black iron of the locomotive. Puff! There was no sound of metal meeting synthetic glove. The worker's hand didn't bounce off solid iron. It sank an inch into the black surface, as if the engine were made of thick, frozen smoke. The worker yanked his hand back with a sharp, terrified yelp. He stumbled backward, tripping over the rail and falling heavily onto his back in the gray ash snow. What the hell? He scrambled away on his hands and knees, pointing his blinding yellow torch directly at the train's wheels. The beam of light passed clean through the black steel drive wheels, illuminating the ballast stones and timber ties on the far side of the track. The train threw no shadow. It had no weight. It sat on the rails like a tear in the fabric of the world. It isn't real," the worker stammered, his breath coming in short, panic hitches. It's not there. "It is real enough," Mateo barked, stepping off the platform onto the gravel. "And it's leaving soon. Get off the tracks before you get tangled in the pass." The worker scrambled his feet, backing away toward the wooden platform steps. He pulled a thick, rectangular digital device from a waterproof chest pocket on his jacket. The screen lit up with a brilliant blue-white glare. "No signal," the worker muttered, his thumb tapping the glass frantically. "No GPS lock. Searching for satellite searching." He held the glowing rectangle up toward the slate-gray sky. Come on. I'm right near the Interstate 90 cut." Mateo squinted at the glowing box in the man's hand. "What is that glass?" The worker looked at Mateo as if he had spoken in an ancient tongue. "What?" "It's my phone. My rugged phone." He flipped the screen around, showing it to Mateo. "Look, the clock says November 14th, 2026. 11:58 p.m. I need call the district depot in Spokane." Mateo stared at the glowing numbers on the tiny glass plate. 2026. A sudden, Sharp ache blossomed behind Mateo's temples. A cold, sickening throb that made his vision blur for a second. The number felt absurd, heavy and sharp, like an iron nail driven into a wooden beam. "It's 1948, Mateo said automatically. The words left his tongue before he could process them. He hadn't thought about the year in a long time. Time in the valley was measured in the clearing of the rails, the accumulation of the gray flakes, and the arrival of the 2359. But as he spoke the date, he remembered a calendar hanging in his kitchen, a paper calendar from the Northern Pacific Railway, featuring a glossy painting of a steam locomotive under a bright blue sky, its pages forever turned to November 1948. The worker stopped tapping his phone. He stared at Mateo, then at Clara, who was standing in the shadows of the ticket booth, her gray shawl pulled tight over her pale, featureless face. 1948? The worker repeated, a nervous, breathless laugh bubbling out of his throat. Are you guys running a prank? Is this some kind of historical reenactment village? He stepped onto the wooden platform, his heavy boots making a loud, sharp crunch-crunch sound against the timber boards, a sound so vibrant, so dense with life, that it made the dark station building groan in response. "Where's the highway?" the worker asked, his voice rising in panic as he swept his flashlight across the platform. "The I-90 pass is right above this ridge. The Snoqualmie avalanche shed is supposed to be right here." He pointed his light at the mountain wall behind the station. There was no concrete avalanche shed. There was no highway. There were only high, sheer granite cliffs, choking pine trees, and the silent, endless fall of gray ash snow. Clara stepped forward from the shadows. The yellow beam of the worker's flashlight caught her face. The worker gasped, dropping his flashlight onto platform boards. In the brilliant, artificial light of his torch, Clara's skin was completely transparent. The wooden wall of the ticket window was clearly visible right through her skull. Her eyes were empty, gray hollows, and her frayed shawl fluttered in the breeze that only existed around her. "Jesus!" The worker screamed, backing away until his heels hit the edge of the platform. You're dead. You're all dead." "We are keeping the line clear," Mateo said, his voice flat, though his hands were shaking so hard the birch broom rattled against his boots. "We have work to do." "No!" the worker shrieked, picking up his fallen flashlight and pointing it wildly at Mateo. "Look at yourself, man. Look at your hands." Mateo looked down. He held his left hand up to the bright yellow beam of the worker's torch. The light passed straight through his skin. He could see his knuckles, hazy and thin like smoke, and beneath them, the rough grain of the birch broom handle, illuminated as if his flesh were made of grease paper. From the dark engine at the front of the train came a single, deep vibration. Thump! The black ice on the passenger coach windows began crack. The sound of cracking ice echoed across the platform like a series of sharp rifle shots. Snap! Crack, crack! Along the flank of the silent black train, the thick, obsidian frost coating the coach windows began to web into thousands of fine, white fractures. Behind the spiderweb glass, the dark shape sat motionless, but the air surrounding the train grew unnaturally cold. A cold that cut straight to the highway worker's heavy neon jacket and settled deep inside his bones. Mateo pulled his hand back from the yellow beam of the flashlight, shoving his translucent fingers deep into the pockets of his oilskin vest. His chest heaved, though no air moved in or out of his lungs. "It's the light," Mateo said, his voice dropping into a harsh, desperate rasp. "Turn off that lamp. You're messing with the frost. If the glass clears, the train won't hold." "The train isn't real," the worker screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria as he stumbled back toward the station wall. "You aren't real. None of this is here." He backed into the wooden ticketing booth, his pack slamming against the weather-beaten pine planks. He reached into his chest pocket again, pulling out his rugged digital phone with a hand that shook so violently he almost dropped it into the snow. "Look at the map," the worker yelled, thrusting the glowing blue screen toward Mateo's face. "Look at it, you crazy old bastard. Look." Mateo didn't want to look. Every instinct honed over decades of sweeping the iron told him to turn his back, to take his birch broom, and to clear the south switch before the 2359 pulled out. But the blue light of the device pulled his eyes like a hook. On the small glass screen was a bright, colored map, Lines of red and yellow represented highways. Cutting through green and gray terrain contour lines. A red pulsing sat in the center of the display, labeled with bold white text. Snoqualmie Pass, Sector 4. Directly beneath it, a small informational box had popped up from an offline archive cache. Historical site, the High Notch Terminal Disaster, November 14, 1948. At 23:58 Pacific Standard Time, a Class 5 slab avalanche triggered by heavy snowpack collapsed from the western granite face, completely burying the Northern Pacific Rail depot and the surrounding timber settlement under 40 feet of dense debris. All 42 residents, including stationmaster Mateo Vance and his daughter Annalise, were lost. The line was permanently abandoned. Mateo stared at the tiny, sharp letters glowing inside the glass. Stationmaster Mateo Vance. Buried under 40 feet of dense debris. All 42 residents lost. The words did not enter his mind as sound or thought. They felt like heavy iron spikes driven directly into his temples. The dull ache behind his eyes exploded into a blinding, white-hot agony. "No," Mateo whispered. He shook his head, taking a slow step back onto the timber platform. "No. The avalanche missed the valley. It came down the North Gulch. We dug out the shed. We cleared the tracks." "There is no shed," the worker cried out, tears of terror carving clean tracks through the grease and soot on his cheeks. "I'm a snowplow operator for the Washington Department of Transportation. My name is Ryan. I've cleared this pass for 6 years. There's a concrete highway bridge 200 feet above our heads right now. This entire station is buried under 70 years of packed earth and rock." Ryan pointed his flashlight up toward the slate-gray sky. The yellow beam didn't reach the clouds. It illuminated a massive, jagged ceiling of packed blue ice, shattered timber beams, and crushed granite boulders suspended directly above the valley, a frozen sky of earth and rock that hung over the terminal like the roof of a colossal tomb. Mateo looked up. He had looked at that sky 10,000 times, but his eyes had always seen only the gentle, endless fall of gray ash snow. Now, through the tear Ryan's yellow light had cut into the veil, he saw the truth. The gray flakes weren't snow. They were the fine, pulverized dust of crushed granite, slowly trickling down from the mountain that had crushed them all while they slept. "Clara," Mateo choked out, turning around slowly. Clara was standing by the ticket window. She wasn't holding her shawl anymore. The gray fabric had dissolved into wisps of dust. Her face was almost completely gone. Her eyes, her nose, her mouth. They had smoothed out into a featureless, pale gray surface, like a wooden mannequin left out in the rain. When she opened her mouth to speak, no words came out, only the cold, rushing whistle of mountain wind blowing through empty pine branches. HSSSSSSSSSSS. She turned away from Mateo, stepped off the wooden platform, and glided toward the open door of the third passenger car. She didn't use the steps. She floated through the threshold, her pale form dissolving into the dark interior of the coach. Inside the car, another shadow stirred. The passenger sitting in the middle row turned its head away from the window. The frosted glass shattered inward with a soft, musical chime, showering the seat in dark ice dust. The passenger stood up and stepped into the aisle. She wore a navy wool traveling dress with brass buttons, a small leather handbag clutched in her pale, translucent fingers. Her face was young, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a velvet hat. "Annalise!" Mateo gasped, dropping his birch broom onto the platform. The handle clattered against the wood, making a sound like a dead branch snapping. The girl stood in the open doorway of the train. She didn't look angry. She didn't look afraid. She looked at Mateo with eyes that held the quiet, infinite peace of someone who had been waiting in a warm room for a very long time. "The train is ready, Father." Her voice echoed, not from her lips, but from the dark iron wheels beneath the car. "The tracks are clear. You don't have to sweep anymore." Ryan, the highway worker, fell to his knees on the platform, holding his glowing phone against his chest, staring at the apparition in absolute, speech-deprived horror. "What is that train?" Ryan whimpered, his voice barely a breath. If you died in 1948, what is that train?" Mateo looked from his daughter's hand to the long, dark line of black coaches stretching into the tunnel gloom. The midnight terminal had never been a sanctuary. The rules had never been about survival. The broom, the iron rails, the endless sweeping of the granite dust. They were the manifestation of his own refusal to accept that his daughter had died on her way back to him, buried in the dark under 40 feet of snow. He had bound himself, Clara, and every soul in the valley to this liminal hell, forcing them to sweep away the memory of their own deaths night after night. The black train wasn't a monster come and take them. It was the final return. It was the only way out of the avalanche. From the front of the engine, the silent iron bell at the front of the locomotive swung back and forth in a slow, hypnotic arc. It made no metallic toll, no chiming ring. Instead, with every swing of the black iron clapper, a wave of profound, tranquil warmth pulsed outward from the engine, washing across the wooden platform. Where the invisible vibration touched the air, the falling gray flakes of granite dust dissolved into nothingness. On his knees, Ryan gasped. The frantic trembling in his limbs began to abate. The yellow beam of his flashlight flickered, dimmed, and stabilized, casting a soft glow across the worn timber planks. He looked up at Annalise standing in the open coach door, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and overwhelming awe. "It's not an engine," Ryan whispered, his phone screen slipping from his numb fingers onto the snow. It's a bridge." Mateo stood motionless on the ballast stones between the iron rails. He looked down at his right hand. The birch broom handle felt weightless now, like a ghost's stick. His knuckles were nearly invisible, reduced to faint ribbons of gray smoke curling around the wood. "Annalise!" Mateo called out, his voice no longer raspy or harsh, but thin and soft, like a breeze blowing across open water. "I waited for you. Every night. I kept the frog clear. I didn't let the ice take the points." Annalise stepped down from the coach door. Her foot touched the timber platform with no sound, but where her soul met the wood, a small ring of bright, green grass flared into existence for a split second before fading into the pine grain. She walked toward the edge of the platform, extending her pale, translucent hand toward him. "You didn't have to sweep, Father," she said softly. Her voice carried the faint, sweet warmth of a summer afternoon in the valley before the mountain fell. "The train was never late. You just wouldn't let it stop." Mateo looked back down the long line of tracks. In the dim amber light of the station lanterns, he saw the truth of his decades of labor. He hadn't been protecting the valley from the cold. He hadn't been keeping the village alive. His endless sweeping of the gray ash was a physical manifestation of his own denial, a heavy, suffocating loop of grief that held 41 other souls trapped in the cold granite dust of their own graves, preventing them from boarding the train that would take them past a mountain. Old Thomas sitting frozen in his rocking chair, Clara fading into a featureless mannequin, the widow Vance whose voice had turned to wind. They weren't fading because they were sick. They were fading because they were exhausted. They were waiting for him to drop the broom. "I thought, if the tracks went gray, I'd lose you forever," Mateo wept. The tears that spilled over his hollow cheeks were not water. They were tiny, shining sparks of silver light that fell onto the iron rail and vanished. "You can't lose what's already waiting for you, Father," Annalise said gently. She turned her head slightly, looking at Ryan, who was watching them from the wooden floorboards. "And the living cannot stay in the terminal." Ryan flinched, holding his breath as the girl's calm gray eyes fixed upon him. "He came down the mountain notch," Mateo said, looking at the highway worker in the neon-orange coat. "He has a life up there, on the concrete bridge." "He came through the tear in your memory," Annalise replied. "If you board the train, the tear will close. The avalanche will rest, and he can walk back to the road." Mateo looked down at the birch broom in his hands. The wood was dark, stained with decades of sweat, salt, and black oil grease. It had been his weapon against reality, his anchor to a world that had ceased to exist on a cold November night in 1948. Slowly, with a long, shuddering breath that cleared the last lingering taste of cold cinder from his mouth, Mateo loosened his grip. Thud! The broom fell to ballast stones between the iron rails. The moment it would touch the ground, the handle splintered, dissolving instantly into a handful of dry, brown birch leaves that were swept away by a sudden, warm breeze rising from the valley floor. The black train let out a soft, deep sigh of released steam. along the entire length of the 10-passenger coaches. The frosted black ice covering the windows shattered into millions of tiny, iridescent crystals that drifted up into the sky like stars. The interior lights of the cars flared to life, not with sickly amber kerosene, but with a warm, golden radiance that bathed the platform in light. In the windows of the cars, faces appeared. Old Thomas was sitting near the front of the second coach, his face whole and warm again, holding a cup of steaming tea. Clara sat by the window of the fourth car, her gray shawl replaced by a bright wool coat, smiling softly as she looked out at the station. All 41 residents of the buried terminal were there, seated in the velvet chairs, warm, whole, and quiet. Annalise held out her hand to Mateo one last time. "Come home, father," she whispered. Mateo turned to Ryan. The highway worker was sitting back against the station wall, his hands resting on his knees, his face washed in the golden light of the train. "Don't look for the tracks when you get back to your plow, boy," Mateo said, his voice resonant, peaceful, and solid. "Leave the valley to the snow." Ryan nodded slowly, unable to speak, tears streaming down his face. "I will. I promise." Mateo stepped off the ballast stones and onto the wooden platform. He took his daughter's hand. Where their fingers joined, the translucent gray under their skin vanished, filled instantly with the warm, vibrant color of life. Hand in hand, they walked to the open door of the third coach and stepped onto the iron board. Clack, clack. The heavy oak door glided shut, sealing with a soft, airtight sound. The black engine did not roar or blow its whistle. Its drive rods moved with a smooth, effortless glide. The train began to roll south down the cleared iron rails. It moved without noise, accelerating rapidly into the darkness of the narrow canyon. Its golden windows casting long, warm rectangles of light across the timber terminal before vanishing into the mountain. The silence that followed the departure of the black train was unlike anything Ryan had ever experienced. It was not merely the absence of sound. It was an active, crushing void. The golden light that had illuminated the timber platform bled away, swallowed instantly by the returning gloom of the valley. Ryan remained on his knees, his hands pressed flat against the rough wood of the station floorboards. His heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird, fast, violent, and undeniably alive. Crack! The sound echoed from the high timber eaves above the ticket office. Ryan jerked his head up. The yellow beam of his flashlight flickered erratically as the air pressure in the valley shifted violently. The massive ceiling of blue ice crushed granite and shattered pine logs. The ancient avalanche debris that had hung suspended over the terminal was beginning to groan under its immense weight. Without Mateo's broom to hold the boundary, the illusion was shattering. The wooden platform beneath Ryan began to turn soft, the weathered pine planks dissolving into fine, dry sawdust that trickled away into the darkness below. The heavy log walls of the station house thinned, turning into translucent ghosts of timber before evaporating into gray air. "Shit!" Ryan gasped, scrambling to his feet. He lunged forward, grabbing his glowing digital phone from the disintegrating snow. The screen flickered wildly. No signal. Searching. GPS lock established. A sharp, piercing chime erupted from the phone speaker, an automated collision avoidance warning from the Department of Transportation Network. The blue map display zoomed in rapidly, the red solidifying on a modern digital vector. Location: Snoqualmie Pass, Sector 4 Avalanche Shed Maintenance Cut. Elevation: 3,120 feet. Move! Ryan screamed himself. He turned toward the western notch, the zigzag trail where he had stumbled down into the valley. The path was disappearing. The deep drifts of gray ash snow were melting into cascades of cold, muddy water and loose gravel. The giant pine trees along the granite slope were dissolving into black mist. Ryan ran, his heavy, rubber-soled boots dug into the wet gravel as he threw his weight up the steep embankment. Behind him, the structural decay of the liminal space accelerated. Tum, tum. The heavy timber foundation of the midnight terminal collapsed in on itself with a sound like muffled thunder. The iron rails, the wooden switches, the ticket booth, all of it dissolved into a massive cloud of fine, gray granite dust that billowed up the gorge. Ryan didn't look back. He scrambled up the muddy slope, pulling himself up by exposed hemlock roots, his lungs burning with cold, real oxygen. The air changed. The suffocating smell of cold cinders and ancient rot vanished, replaced by the sharp, stinging scent of fresh diesel exhaust and crushed pine needles. With a final, desperate heave, Ryan threw his upper body over the crest of the concrete retaining wall. His gloved hands caught the cold, galvanized steel of a highway guardrail. He dragged himself onto the shoulder of Interstate 90. The world of November 2026 slammed into his senses with deafening force. The roar of a twin-turbo diesel snowplow engine filled the pass. High-intensity orange strobe lights swept across 30-foot banks of pure, blinding white snow. The wind whipped past his helmet, driving sharp, icy needles of real winter against his face. 50 yards down the snowbound highway, his own yellow Mack plow truck stood idling in the emergency lane, its hazard lights flashing, hydraulic fluid leaking onto the pristine snow from a severed hose. Ryan lay on his back on the salted asphalt, gasping for air, staring up at the dark, starry night sky above Snoqualmie Pass. "Ryan! Hey, Ryan!" A pair of heavy boots crunched rapidly through the snowbank. Marcus, the night shift supervisor for Sector 4, sprinted toward him, holding a high-powered LED searchlight. Marcus threw himself down beside Ryan, grabbing the lapels of his neon-orange jacket. "Jesus Christ, Ryan!" Marcus yelled over the roar of the idling truck. "Where the hell have you been? Your radio went dead 45 minutes ago. We thought you fell over the lip of the cut." Ryan sat up slowly, his hands trembling violently as he pointed down over the concrete retaining wall into the pitch-black abyss of the gorge. The station? Ryan wheezed, his voice raw. "The high-notch terminal." Marcus frowned, swinging his searchlight down into the ravine. The beam of light cut through the falling white snow, illuminating the bottom of the gorge 70 feet below. There was no wooden platform. There were no iron rails. There was no black train. There was only a dense, ancient forest of alpine firs growing out a massive, rounded mound of buried granite rock and frozen mud. The permanent scar of the 1948 slide. "What are you talking about?" Marcus asked, pulling Ryan to his feet. "There's nothing down there, man. That's just the old slide debris. Come on, get in the supervisor's rig before you get hypothermia." Ryan let Marcus lead him toward the idling pickup truck. But as he reached the door, he stopped and looked down at his right boot. Stuck to the heavy rubber tread of his left sole was not the white, slushy snow of the highway. It was a single dry, brown birch leaf, completely intact, smelling faintly of warm summer grass. The Sector 4 maintenance depot smelled of hot hydraulic oil, diesel fumes, and wet asphalt. High above the concrete bay floor, yellow halide floodlights hummed, casting a sharp glare over the lined-up snowplows and salt spreaders. Inside the glass-walled shift supervisor's office, the air was uncomfortably warm, heated by a rattling electric radiator that smelled of scorched dust. Ryan sat on a metal folding chair, a thick wool blanket draped over his shoulders. He held a paper cup of lukewarm black coffee in both hands, staring blankly at the scarred linoleum desk in front of him. Sitting across the desk was shift supervisor Mateo Vance, along with Officer Miller from the Washington State Patrol. Miller's neon yellow high-visibility jacket hung over the back of his chair, his radio clicking sporadically with static from the past traffic. "Let's go over one more time, Ryan," Officer Miller said, opening a black leather notebook and clicking a ballpoint pen. "You were clearing the westbound shoulder at milepost 52. Your plow line blew a seal at 23:15. What happened next?" "I told you," Ryan said. His voice was quiet, raspy, stripped of any emotion. "I stepped out to check the hydraulic valve. I lost my footing on the frozen crust and slid down the service cut into the ravine." "Right," Miller said, making a small mark in his notebook. "And how long were you down in the gulch?" "I don't know," Ryan murmured. My watch stopped. Marcus leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "Ryan, your transponder went dark at 23:18. We found you standing on the shoulder of I-90 at 0:45. That's an hour and 27 minutes. In sub-zero winds, without your thermal gloves on." "I had them in my pocket," Ryan said flatly. "Your core temp when we brought you into the rig was 98.6, Marcus pressed, his brow furrowed in deep concern. "You weren't shivering. You weren't frostbitten. Hell, Your jacket wasn't even wet. How do you spend an hour and a half at the bottom of the high-notch ravine during a winter storm and come out looking like you just stepped out of a coffee shop? Ryan didn't answer. He took a slow sip of the stale coffee. He knew what would happen if he mentioned the wooden platform, the birch broom, or the silent black train with its warm, golden windows. They would pull his commercial driver's license, schedule a mandatory psychiatric evaluation in Seattle, and write off his experience as severe nitrogen-like hypoxia or trauma-induced hallucination. He was disoriented Marcus. Officer Miller offered smoothly, waving his hand. Extreme cold does weird things to temporal perception. People think they've been out for 5 minutes when it's been 2 hours. Yeah, but look at the maintenance log, Marcus said, pulling a printout sheet from a clip folder. He pointed a thick finger at the timestamp line. At 23:59, the exact minute the old 1948 slide hit the historical depot 78 years ago, the seismic sensors embedded in the concrete avalanche shed picked up a pulse. Miller glanced at the sheet. A snow slide. No, Marcus said, shaking his head. That's the crazy part. It wasn't a mass movement of snow or rock. It was a single, sharp acoustic vibration. High frequency. Localized right at the base of the old terminal site. The automated system flagged it as an iron resonance. Ryan's hand tightened around his paper cup, crushing the cardboard slightly. The bell, he thought. The silent iron bell. Officer Miller closed his notebook with a soft thud. Look, Marcus. The guy had a close call. His rig broke down. He took a spill down an embankment, and he made it back up. The pass is clear. The storm is moving east, and nobody got hurt. Let's not turn mechanical failure into an episode of The Twilight Zone. Miller stood up, strapping his duty belt back around his waist. Get some sleep, Ryan. Take tomorrow's shift off. Have the shop guys look at your plow line in the morning. Thanks, officer, Ryan said softly. Miller nodded and stepped out of the office, the glass door clicking shut behind him. Marcus remained seated at his desk. He stared at Ryan for a long time, the hum of the overhead lights filling the silence between them. Slowly, Marcus reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, clear plastic evidence bag. He set it gently on the linoleum surface between them. Inside the bag lay the single brown birch leaf Ryan had found stuck to his boot tread, dry, intact, and uncrushed. I found this on the floor mat of the supervisor's rig after we brought you in, Marcus said quietly. Ryan looked at the leaf, then up into Marcus's eyes. Birch trees don't grow in the high-notch pass, Ryan, Marcus murmured, his voice dropping into a low whisper. Not at 3,000 feet, and certainly not in the middle of November. Marcus leaned closer across the desk. My great-uncle was Thomas Vance, Marcus whispered, his eyes searching Ryan's face with a strange, haunting intensity. He was 19 years old. He lived in the timber settlement beside the depot. They never found his body after the 48 avalanche. Ryan felt a sudden, cold shiver run down his spine. Not a fear, but profound, quiet awe. Did he say anything about him? Marcus asked, his voice trembling slightly. The old stationmaster? Ryan looked down at the plastic bag, touching the outline of the birch leaf through the clear film. Old Thomas was sitting near the front of the second coach. Ryan said softly, looking back up at Marcus. He had a cup of warm tea. He wasn't cold anymore. Marcus stared at Ryan. His chest rose and fell in a long, shuddering breath. He didn't ask another question. He didn't call Officer Miller back. He simply reached out, took the evidence bag, and slid it carefully into his vest pocket, right over his heart. Go home, Ryan, Marcus said softly, a faint, peaceful smile touching the corners of his mouth. The line is clear. 3 days after the avalanche shed sensors recorded the acoustic pulse, a specialized geotechnical survey team from the State Department of Transportation set up a temporary monitoring station at the edge of Sector 4. The snowstorm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, brittle cold under a sky of pale, cloudless blue. Sunbeams glinted off the 30-foot snowbanks lining Interstate 90, but deep down in a high-notch ravine, where the sun never reached, the shadows remained thick, icy, and blue. Ryan stood near the edge of the concrete retaining wall, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his heavy canvas work coat. He was off duty, but he hadn't been able to stay away. Beside him, Dr. Elena Rostova, a senior geophysicist specializing in alpine ground-penetrating radar, adjusted the thermal scope mounted on a heavy carbon fiber tripod. She wiped a frost-dusted thumb across the viewing screen, her brow creased under a thick knitted hat. "It doesn't make any structural sense, Ryan," Dr. Rostova murmured, not taking her eyes off the display. "Look at the density readouts for the lower gulch." Ryan stepped closer, looking over her shoulder at the glowing green vector graphics mapping the Earth 60 feet below. "What are we looking at?" Ryan asked. For 78 years, every geological survey of this past logged a solid, compressed mass of granite aggregate, frozen mud, and timber debris filling the bottom of the gorge, she explained, tapping the screen. "It's what we call a dead void, completely packed, zero air pockets, completely stabilized by ice mortar. And now, Rostova said, switching the scan to a low-frequency sonic resonance map, the lower 70 feet of the gulch reads like loose gravel. The ice binding the debris didn't melt. There's been no temperature rise in the water table. It's as if the microscopic crystal structure holding 40 feet of packed earth together simply released." She zoomed in on the central coordinates of the old terminal site. On the screen, surrounded by dark blue layers of frozen mountain soil, sat a clean, hollow oval, a zone of absolute silence where the radar pulse returned no echoes at all. It formed a smooth, precise corridor cutting straight through the base of the ancient landslide, running from the north tunnel wall to the south canyon notch. It was the exact width of a standard-gauge railroad track. "Is there an open cavity down there?" Ryan asked, his heart beating with a quiet, steady rhythm. "No," Rostova said, shaking her head in utter bewilderment. "The soil is there, the rock is there, but it's sitting loose, undisturbed, as if something passed through the solid earth and left the grain aligned in one direction, like iron filings after a magnet glides over them." She turned her head, looking out over the silent ravine. "And there's one more thing," she added, her voice dropping. "The acoustic sensors we planted at the lip of the cut yesterday morning keep picking up an ambient harmonic." Ryan's throat tightened. "What kind of harmonic?" Rostova pulled a pair of heavy rubberized headphones from her jacket and handed them to Ryan. "Listen for yourself. It's sitting right at 432 hertz. It doesn't match diesel traffic from the highway, and it's not wind sheer against the pines." Ryan took the headphones and pressed them over his ears. At first, there was only the cold, hollow static of the mountain air, the sound of empty space and frozen granite. But beneath the static, deep down in the sub-bass frequencies of the earth itself, came a rhythmic, sweeping resonance. Hiss-scrape, hiss-scrape. It was soft, fading into the distance like a ghost of a broom clearing dry leaves from an iron rail. And above that soft, sweeping rhythm sat a faint, lingering warmth, the unmistakable scent of dry pine, cedar chests, and summer grass, rising up through 60 feet of snow and rock in the freezing mountain air. Ryan pulled the headphones off, handing them back to the geophysicist with a small, quiet nod. "Is it a hazard to the highway structure?" Ryan asked gently. Rostova looked back at her monitors, watching the smooth, clean corridor of zero resonance, holding firm beneath the weight of the mountain. "No," she whispered, her eyes wide with a quiet, unscientific awe. "The slope is more stable than it's been in a century. It's as if the mountain isn't holding a strain anymore. It's just resting." Ryan walked away from the survey tripod, stepping up to the edge of the galvanized guardrail. He looked down into the shadowy depths of the high-notch ravine. The gray ash snow was gone. The dark alpine firs stood quiet under the blue sky, their branches holding real, pristine white snow. Far below, where the old wooden platform had stood, the canyon floor was completely still. No train rolled through the dark. No oil lanterns burned in the ticket window. The terminal was gone, its long night ended, its souls finally delivered past the mountain. Ryan reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against his phone. He didn't check the time. He didn't look for a signal. He simply leaned against the cold steel railing, pulled a deep breath of clean mountain air into his lungs, and watched the winter sun rise over the ridge. 30 years passed over the Cascade Mountains, smoothing the rough edges of human memory as gently as winter snow rounds the sharp corners of granite rock. By November 2056, the old maintenance depot at Sector 4 had been decommissioned and replaced by an automated weather monitoring array 2 miles down the pass. The concrete retaining wall along Interstate 90 remained, but the old highway above the high-notch ravine had been designated a scenic bypass, quiet and rarely traveled except by local forestry crews. An old electric truck rolled to a quiet stop on the gravel shoulder near milepost 52. The door opened, and Ryan stepped out onto the cold, crisp pavement. He was 68 now, his hair completely white, his movements slower and measured, but his eyes retained the sharp, clear hazel brightness of a man who had spent his life watching the sky. From the passenger side, his 19-year-old granddaughter, Clara, named in quiet remembrance of a woman whose face he had seen dissolve into gray dust, stepped out, wrapping a warm wool scarf around her neck. "Is this the place, Grandpa?" Clara asked, looking over the concrete guardrail down into the vast, pine-choked gorge below. "This is it," Ryan said, his voice deep and mellow by age. He walked to the edge of the wall, leaning his forearms against the cold galvanized steel. The valley below was brilliant under a late afternoon sun. There was no gray ash snow, no suffocating atmosphere. The mountain firs stood tall, their deep green needles dusted with pure, crystalline white, and the sound of a mountain creek rushing to the lower rocks rose softly through the clear air. Clara walked up beside him, looking down into the deep shade of the ravine. "You worked this pass for 30 years, but you never brought me to this specific pullout. I needed the time to settle," Ryan said smoothly, a small, peaceful smile touching his lips. "Some places need decades before they're ready for visitors." He pointed down toward a small natural bench on the eastern slope of the gulch, a quiet spot where the old terminal's timber platform had once sat. Growing right in the center of that rocky clearing, defying the harsh 3,000-foot elevation and the frozen alpine soil, stood a single magnificent white birch tree. Its slender trunk gleamed like polished bone against the dark granite wall behind it, its golden autumn leaves fluttering gently in the crisp mountain breeze. Clara blinked, her brow furrowing in surprise. "A white birch? Up here? I thought birches couldn't take the winter soil at this altitude." "They usually can't," Ryan murmured. "That one took root 30 years ago. It's been growing there ever since." Clara looked at her grandfather, sensing the deep, quiet reverence in his posture. "Marcus Vance left you his old journal before he passed away last year, didn't he? The one with the notes about your shift in 26. "He did," Ryan nodded softly. "Marcus spent his whole life wondering if his great-uncle Thomas was cold down here. He spent 30 years knowing he wasn't." Ryan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. Inside lay the single dry birch leaf he had carried in his pocket since that fateful night in 1948's shadow. Time had not crumbled it. It remained whole, smooth and dry, smelling of cedar and warm summer grass. He held it out in his palm, letting his granddaughter touch its delicate, veins-lined surface. "What did the stationmaster tell you, Grandpa?" Clara asked quietly. "Before he boarded the train?" Ryan looked down at the birch tree on the ridge, his mind returning to the sight of Mateo Vance dropping his broom onto the ballast stones, stepping into the warm, golden light of the passenger car alongside his daughter Annalise. "He told me that you can't lose what's already waiting for you," Ryan said softly. "He told me that the living shouldn't stay in the terminal, and that the best thing a man can do when his work is done is let the line go clear." Clara leaned her head against Ryan's shoulder, looking out over the vast, sunlit expanse of the Cascade Range. Down in the quiet depths of the high notch, the golden leaves of the solitary birch tree caught the last rays of the setting sun, glowing like a warm lantern in the dark timber of the valley. There was no sound of sweeping brooms. There was no iron bell tolling in the dark. The pass was open, the tracks were at rest, and the mountain was finally asleep. Night fell over the Cascade Range with a slow, velvet gradient, turning the deep indigo sky into a canopy of brilliant, unblinking stars. On the high shoulder of Interstate 90, the electric truck had long since departed, its tires leaving no trace on the dry, quiet gravel. The scenic bypass sat empty, resting under the silent guard of the towering alpine firs. Down in the high-notch ravine, the temperature dropped well below freezing, but the air felt crisp, light, and clean. There was no oily gray ash snow drifting from the sky. The snow that lay upon the rocks was pure white, sparkling under the starlight like crushed diamond. Beside the solitary white birch tree on the eastern ridge, where the wooden platform of the midnight terminal had once stood, the ground was smooth and undisturbed. In the quiet depths of the earth, 60 feet beneath the roots of the birch, the space where the station house had been buried in 1948 remained at total peace. The 41 souls who had swept the iron rails for nearly a century were no longer bound to the cold granite dust. They had passed to the mountain, their names restored, their faces whole, seated together in the warm, golden cars of the black train as it rolled past the edge of the world. And far down the line, past the narrow canyon bridge, past the dark granite tunnel, beyond the boundaries of any map drawn by the living, the 2359 continued its smooth, soundless journey. It didn't run on iron rails anymore. It glided through a vast, sunlit valley that knew no winter, no avalanches, and no stop clocks. Inside the third passenger coach, sitting by a wide, unfrosted window, Mateo Vance looked out at the green, rolling hills stretching to the horizon. Beside him, Annalise rested her head against his shoulder, her hand warm and solid inside his. The old silver pocket watch in Mateo's vest pocket was no longer stuck at 2354. Its brass hands moved with a quiet, steady tick, ticking forward into a morning that would never end. Mateo reached into his pocket and pulled out the old paper calendar from a Northern Pacific Railway. He didn't look for November 1948. With a gentle, peaceful smile, he opened the coach window and let the paper slip from his fingers. The wind caught it, carrying the dry pages away into bright, open sky, where they dissolved like sea foam on a rising tide. Back on the High Notch Pass, a soft mountain breeze swept down from the western ridge. It rustled the dry golden leaves of the white birch tree, producing a gentle, rhythmic whisper, hiss, scrape, that sounded like the ghost of an old broom clearing the way. But as the wind lifted into the starry night, the sound transformed into a soft, melodic sigh, fading into the eternal quiet of the mountains. The terminal was gone, the broom was at rest, and the line was clear forever.